Looks like we're still waiting for a couple more members, but in the meantime, Alex, why don't I switch presenter mode over to you so you can get that PowerPoint going.
Can you see the slide deck?
Yes, we got it.
Awesome.
Okay, I'm just trying to get a couple people help signing on, and we'll start in another minute. I'm just resending the link. All right, good afternoon. Let's go ahead and get started. My name is Rosa Mendez. I'm DEC's Director of their Office for Environmental Justice, and welcome to the Climate Justice Working Group today on March 24th. We'll go ahead and get started with our roll call to make sure we have our working group members here. And let's start with who I can see first. We have Abigail.
I'm here. Glad to see you all. And I apologize. I'm going to have to head a little early today.
And then do we have Eddie?
Hi, yes, sorry.
How about Jonathan?
All right. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm here.
Hello. And Rawa.
Hi, everyone.
Let's see, I think I saw Sonal. Are you on?
Yes, present. Hi, everyone.
How about Jared?
Good afternoon, folks. Happy to be here.
And Amy, are you on today? How about Mary Beth?
Hi there. Hope everyone is having a good day.
And Elizabeth. Okay, Neil, are you on?
I am. Yep. Hey, good afternoon, everybody.
And Joe?
Hi, good afternoon. I'm here.
And Chris, are you on? I think I saw you.
I am. Good afternoon, everyone.
Great. All right. Thanks, everyone, for being here this afternoon. We also have assisting us today, Alana Cadell-Tucky from the EJ office, and I believe Jared Snyder is joining us as well. Illume, do you want to introduce yourselves?
Sure. I'm Alex Dunn from Illume. Amanda, you're on mute.
Hi, I'm Amanda Dwelly with Illume Advising.
Great. Thanks, everyone. Alex, will you move us forward?
Yep.
Great. So next, after our welcome and roll call, we're going to get into our business items, go over reflections from our last meeting, and then we're going to have another status update for the data analysis that's been going on and some insight into how could we score, what are different ways to approach the scoring process for these criteria, including evaluating some scenarios, because I remember there was some suggestions for visuals so we could see what we mean by combining different criteria. So we're going to go through that. We're going to talk a little bit more about ground truthing, and then we'll get into some next steps. So Alex, for our next slide, please. So reflection from our last meeting, we did have representatives from California here, and we had a great dialogue with them, hearing about their experience with the disadvantaged communities definition as it was created in California, including talking about how they engage the public around that definition and their thoughts around implementation and lessons learned from their process. We are working to schedule follow-up, and if you have any other follow-up questions, specific ones, if you could please send those to me if you haven't already, or post to the SharePoint, and we'll get those out there and schedule more time with the three ladies who were with us and gave us so much of their time. We also had Alex give us an update on all the things going on around the data sets, progress on downloading. She also talked about a way to organize them. So we have the pillars from the legislation, and Alex talked about organizing them into threats and vulnerabilities. And then she also introduced a ground truthing exercise, which included a Tableau tool for working group members to play around with, check it out, look at the areas and see their census tract numbers and provide those numbers to Alex and I, thinking about this is an area that you for sure from your understanding knows to be a disadvantaged community considering the criteria we've been talking about. If you haven't shared that with Alex and I, please send those over. We do find them very helpful in terms of the data analysis moving forward. That ground truthing really helps us know if we're on the right track or if there's other things we need to be considering. So that's a reflection from the meeting. You all received the draft minutes from that meeting. Any other thoughts? Does anyone want to open discussion on those minutes? Don't see any hands. Would anyone like to open a motion to approve the minutes into final form?
I will. This is Mary Beth McEwen.
Thanks, Mary Beth. And a second, please.
I'll second.
Thanks, Abigail. And then I hope you all remember what I like to do to record your votes. If you go over to that feedback thing, it looks like a little megaphone. Click on it and you'll see the options for yes or no. You could place your votes now for approving the minutes as final. All right, great. And the minutes pass as final. Thank you very much, everyone. Does anyone have other thoughts to bring up from last week's meeting that you want to bring up now before we move into the next portion of our agenda? Okay, great. Alex, let's move on.
So we wanted to give you a bit of an update. So it's been 2 weeks. So we have been doing a lot, but it's been 2 weeks. And I see Eddie's question about do we have a deadline to help for the ground truthing? I would say that the sooner the better for the ground truthing. We'll talk about it more, but we're at the point where your input, those data points, are pretty vital for us making some decisions. But we'll go a little bit more into that. So if you can carve out the time, that would be huge. I know it's asking a lot. Okay. By the way, if you see me looking at another screen, I figured out how to like have my cake and eat it too with the screen and the people and the PowerPoint. So if I'm looking away from you, it's actually that I'm looking at you. So just, you know, enjoy that. Okay, so you've now seen this like test and develop and apply and learn and things like that. We're at the like bottom squiggly bits right now inside the develop. So we've been running a bunch of scenarios and testing and comparing things. And we're going to give you a couple examples of scenarios, not in maps, not in things, but just with some things to talk through because there are some decisions we need to make and we need your guidance on like what feels right to you. So you don't need to worry about the methods part, but we really need to hear what feels right to you and the things that we compare and talk about now. But this is very much a loop-de-loop, like we're going back and forth, and you'll see why as we build in. There's a lot of things that we're trying to consider. So currently we're working on the critical data pieces. Those are the ones that the indicators that we think are going to be really, really important. Amanda's going to speak to those in a few minutes of what we're in need, but still haven't gotten. We've been creating lots of different scenarios and combinations of criteria and indicators. How do we put them together so that to create a scenario and see how that works? And then we're comparing those combinations and using some data points that we've got. So we've got 3 so far respondents to the ground truthing. So we've been using some of those to try to do some testing, but we need more to get at that. Okay. Excuse me, allergy season. Data considerations coming up. Amanda's going to talk through the data considerations where we're at. You're on mute. Okay.
Great. So this is where we left off last time. We have a bunch of data. We actually have 56 different indicators right now. And we've bucketed them. We first bucketed them by pillar of the legislation related to pollution burden as the first pillar, population characteristics and historical discrimination as the second, and climate risks and vulnerabilities but as the third. And as we discussed last time, in each of these pillars, there's a mix of what we might consider threats, either exposures to pollutants, pollution burdens, hazards, or characteristics of the land use and environment, or population vulnerabilities, or health effects. So we're kind of operating by grouping things in this way. We might have some subgroupings within, and working to make sure we're representing each of the pillars in the legislation in each of these areas, and also representing, in addition to the legislation, everything we talked about in earlier meetings as important concepts to represent. So I'm going to really talk through some of the data that we have and, what we've looked at. So Alex, you can go to the next slide. So we have 56 different indicators on different concepts. In some cases, there's overlap, and we might have several metrics for one thing, especially with kind of demographic, economic data. We might have a bunch of different ways to look at income, or a bunch of different ways to look at a language, or a bunch of different ways to look at environmental hazards. So we're looking at each of those things on their own and in combination. Looking at them on their own, we're looking at data coverage statewide, the granularity of that data, how it was originally collected, the data quality. Really, when we started looking at all those distributions, it raised a lot of questions when we looked at distributions in rural versus urban areas, or looked at regional distributions. That was part of the iterative process of forcing us to ask some questions and go back and see how that data was originally measured or calculated. And in some cases, we excluded variables that we didn't think, were measured very rigorously or really provided the statewide coverage that we needed. We also considered things like whether the data on its own was something that was directly captured or measured. Like census data might be directly captured, and some environmental data, like, a particular facility, we know that facility is there, but in some cases, air toxics and other pollution burdens might be modeled, and we might not know specifically what's happening in each area. So we're kind of also weighing considerations of what format the data is, how good is some of the modeled data. So those were a bunch of things we looked at to kind of see what variables were strong on their own. And then we looked at some of the data in combination to see where there were really high correlations and where one variable might not be necessary because it's really captured by something else, like a lot of things being captured by density. We might not need the density variable on its own if a lot of things are highly correlated, and there's other examples of that. And we're also working really closely with the DEC right now, staff scientists and the DEC, to wade through a bunch of the different EJ screen variables for environmental pollution and air toxics versus other potential New York specific sources for these variables, other potential EPA variables. So we're really in the weeds right now, trying to understand if we can use, even in the short term, some of the EJ screener federal data, and then really prioritizing what's worth it to develop New York specific data. That said, we are still waiting for additional data that could replace some of the indicators that we don't think are particularly strong, but we might end up using in the short term. So the next two slides, there's a lot on these slides, but I figured we could kind of take a look at some of the variables together. So again, there's 56 indicators we're thinking about, and this is our attempt to narrow it down. This is still not narrow enough, given that California now has 20 to 21, 22 indicators, and we do think, as we've discussed it before, a shorter list might be kind of easier to digest and understand, and kind of easier to get out to the public, but still considering some of these different variables. So thinking on the threat side, so still kind of grouping things by the pillars of the legislation, and continue to make sure that we're addressing anything that was specifically mentioned in the legislation and kind of thematically capturing things. The first row shows what we're kind of considering for our current working scenarios. This is all the data that we have to work with to test different scenarios now, and we might be testing some scenarios that include some of these and others we might not be including in every run, but this is kind of what we have to work with, and I'll go through that. And then the bottom is things where we think there might be better data out there or more data out there that we don't have represented, and we're working to obtain, analyze, and prepare this data at the census tract level. A lot of the weight for a lot of these things, as it's really not ready to be analyzed or used at the census tract level, so it'll take a lot of work and decisions and GIS analysis to prepare something that might be points of facilities or something to be used in this census tract way. So that's why there's a bunch of stuff on the bottom that we're very much working toward. So let's just look at, oh, go ahead.
I just want to say, like, so I think on the chat, Eddie had a good question, like, you know, wait a minute, there were like 100 indicators at some point, and now we're down to 56, and now we're even going further down. And so we use the rubric to kind of narrow things down, because gathering all that data, and so that we narrowed it down to like 70 or something, between 60 and 70. And then from there, we got those data, started looking at them, and quickly threw out a bunch that were like missing data and things like that, just were bad. And now what we've done is basically like a gap analysis. This is what Amanda's been looking through, is like, here are the things that we think are good enough for us to really look at and put in. And then here are some things that we think are still critical, that are pending, that we still need to dig through or deal with in some way. Those indicators that are waiting are, as Amanda mentioned, going to require, you know, a lift as far as, because they're just not in the format that we need by census tract and everything else. So anyway, I just wanted to kind of run through that, because it is a significant whittling down, but it's actually really good. You know, as we've learned more about these different indicators, there are a lot that were not good data, and so we immediately threw those out as we learned that. So this is what we do have, and it's actually pretty remarkably good coverage. So that's one of the things that we wanted to talk through here, is that we think we're actually with some of the ones that we're waiting with, in combination with what we have, we're good.
Well, I think that's we're still on the threat side. So there are definitely limitations here in what we can cover on the threat side. I think we're pretty good on vulnerabilities, but we do have some gaps here that mean, oh, go ahead, Eddie.
I see you, Eddie.
A quick question. Thank you so much for the context. Just if you could just flesh out a little bit, Alex and Amanda, like when you say that the data was bad, can you just give a couple of examples? I think you gave one, right, which is it's not collected at the census tract level. But can you give any just one or two other examples of why the data just was insufficient for our needs?
Well, I would have to go back to our list, but that's a great question. So from the 100, first, let me just clarify, down to the 56. In some cases, it was whittling down, and in some cases, we still have gaps that we're trying to fill. So it's not like we threw out 40, we threw out a certain number, but then there's still gaps that we're trying to fill. So in the end, you know, maybe we'll end up with 70 actual data points or something like that. In terms of what, you know, what we didn't consider, something like a formaldehyde. So we have benzene here as, you know, a modeled air toxic, and formaldehyde is, you know, highly correlated, was also based on modeled data, and you know, it follows kind of a similar distribution, and so isn't really adding as much. And benzene, you know, might have higher health risks and correlation to negative public health effects. So kind of narrowing things down based on what is really the best representative of that thing. You know, and let's see, in terms of things that we didn't even collect in some cases, you know, let's see. Oh, access to public transportation. I mean, these could be things we're still looking at. But we found like the data source that we had or thought we had for access to public transportation actually didn't have every transit system covered. So there was big regional disparities in what was covered and not covered. And we found that with a couple of other things as well.
Thank you.
Okay. So thinking about exposures and hazards here on the left, what we basically have now is some EJ screen, most of the EJ screen variables, but DEC staff are actively kind of working through and providing guidance on potential considerations and limitations for that data, and in several cases have suggested using state level data to replace that data. So we're trying to figure out, like, well, is that data good enough to use in the short term? What does it represent? Or should we really wait for additional data? In some cases, there might not be EJ screen data. So my prior comment relates to something like toxic released and waste leakage. There might be a wastewater discharge indicator in EJ screen, but it would be ideal to use state level data if we have it. On the other hand, there's some variables that aren't represented in EJ screen, and we need to do custom analysis, like proximity to power plants or petroleum product terminals. So you see the things on the bottom are things that we might not have represented on the top, or might be substitutes when we get better data. Looking at the middle column, this is a little bit new, actually. Oh, go ahead.
Could you repeat that? I'm sorry. I followed you at arm's length until the very end there. Could you repeat that just last line or two? I'm sorry.
Okay, so the things at the bottom fall into one of two categories. First might be things that that we don't have current indicators for. We have no way to represent, and we're waiting for at least one way to represent it. So something like proximity to power plants fits into that category. And there might be also things on the bottom that are substitutes to things on the top that we might have something to use in the short term, but it would be preferable to use New York State specific data or data collected by a state agency.
Thanks. I think the part of just my own, one of the reasons I'm following from a slight distance is not knowing what had been removed, and the explanations make total sense, but I feel a little bit like I'm flying blind in that I don't know, and don't know if I want to know the universe of threats that were removed. But this is really helpful. Keep going. I'm sorry. I don't know if the other panelists have similar questions, but thank you.
No, I think, we do have that list. It's still very much a working list with things moving from categories every day at this point. And I think that list will be a little bit more concrete when we kind of know if we're going to get some of these other indicators. We could figure out how to document that. And I think that'll be important in the public documentation as well, to kind of show people what we considered and didn't include. Just so people understand that we did look at it or consider it.
That's a great idea, Amanda. Yeah, because I can imagine that when down the line, when the public comment period begins, if this gang came up with over 100 indicators, chances are others will come up with some of the same and even more. So in anticipation of that rollout, kind of capturing what had originally been suggested and why it had been removed, I think DEC would probably find that helpful, and I know other members of the advisory board, so that we don't get accosted in public about why we missed indicator number 49 or 22 or whatever. It'd be helpful to just document that. Thank you.
And to add to that, Amanda, we have the kind of the big indicator list that we had with the 100 plus, and then with the rubric and those that we said that we were going to kind of work with. And then this next step is kind of the immediate snapshot of what we're currently doing, which is within the last week. But what I think we will definitely document that. And I think for this group, we can post that list there so you have it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, with the understanding that things are still shifting as we test out different combinations. We these are things we're playing with at the top. They might not all make it into the final models. These are just things that are in kind of the higher priority consideration set right now, at least for the short term. Okay, and I want to continue talking about, pillar 2. I think this is interesting. So in the process of evaluating some of the air toxics, hazardous sites, industrial and utility land use. We found that we were continually trying to figure out, like, well, is this something, a current threat and a current threat to public health, a current burden, or has it been remediated and it's no longer a threat? And, you know, so we found, okay, should we include this if it's not a current threat, but it was a threat at some point? And, you know, given all the discussions we've had about historical discrimination as it relates to land use and siting facilities, as well as the, you know, Pillar 2 language about populations or groups that have been discriminated against on the basis of race or ethnicity, what we decided is there might be some variables that might relate to hazards or toxics that might not be current threats to public health, but might represent historical discrimination. So we've kind of moved some things from the, you know, kind of current exposures and hazards bucket, Pillar 1, into Pillar 2 to represent things that, you know, might reflect discriminatory land use. So that's kind of a shuffle that's happening as well to kind of retain some of those things and position them as part of Pillar 2 a little bit. So gathering some data on land used for industrial manufacturing or mining purposes, land being used for electric and natural gas utilities, not just the generation facilities, but just land owned and used by utilities, land used for waste. And then something like national priorities list or Superfund sites, a lot of them might have been remediated and might not all pose a current threat, but they certainly represent a legacy of potential discrimination and non-representation in siting decisions.
Sorry, I had a quick question. Apologies for being obnoxious today, and I promise I'll stop. Well, I won't promise to stop being obnoxious in general, just on this call. DEC, quick question, like there have been cases where there have been brownfield remediation where the remediation itself was done, but then later on, a certain golf course comes to mind in the Bronx, where over time, the remediated site actually has some of the volatile organic gases or other gases that get compressed, and because of vapor intrusion, actually squeezes those gases into neighboring sites. So I guess the question is for DEC, like even though a site itself may be remediated, does DEC monitor the surrounding area for vapor intrusion? Because just because that site's remediated doesn't mean that neighboring sites may not be exposed to things like vapor intrusion. So I'm just wondering how DEC processes this proximity to remediated sites, and how the agency in general deals with things like vapor intrusion post remediation, post even development.
Great, thanks, Eddie. That's definitely a question that I would like to run past the remediation team to make sure I give you the correct answer. So I just want to make sure I have it noted correctly. You want to understand how DEC monitors for sites neighboring a remediated site for vapor intrusion. Okay.
Yeah, that's just one example I could think of proximity to a remediated site maybe being a past concern, but in fact may not be. There are a couple of instances in the Bronx, whether it's a golf course or whether it was a school, where the vapor intrusion of a former remediated brownfield site became not just a little, but a significant issue to neighboring sites. So, but I promise I'll shut up. Keep going, guys. Sorry.
Yeah. I mean, no, that's a great question, and we, we're having several in-depth conversations with that team, and Rose and the team will float that. I do want to say, we do plan to, we're looking for some indicators on proximity to environmental remediation sites, understanding that, while we classified it as Pillar 2 as only historical threat, good point, it could be a current threat. I think mathematically, in terms of the way that scoring might be done, at present, we're not necessarily weighting any of these things higher than any other things. We might get to a point that we do that, but right now, kind of mathematically, whether something falls into Pillar 1, 2, or 3, these columns isn't really affecting the scoring that much, though it could in the future. Any other kind of questions on the exposures and hazards and risks in pillars 1 and 2 before we look at 3? I really appreciate detailed questions and comments because we certainly, every single variable we pick, we need to understand really well and know why we're including it and not others and what its strengths and weaknesses are, because that'll all come up under public review. In terms of pillar 3, really just thinking about, that last pillar's vulnerability to climate change. And there's certainly a lot on the people and population side on the next slide. Here, we're just trying to look at kind of land and environmental characteristics. The big items mentioned in the legislation were, coastal flooding risks, storm surge risks, sea level rise, things like that. And in all of those cases, we are waiting to have indicators ready at the census tract level for that. So that's why you see that kind of pillar 3 bottom box is a little bit bigger. And I would say this kind of pillar 3 threats box is where across everything we're probably missing the most right now. And things might change in the numbers you see after we get data that addresses specifically some of these coastal risks and other risks here. What we do have right now is another index from the National Renewable Energy Laboratory on susceptibility to extreme weather, but it's really only broken up into 6 categories, so it doesn't really give us the same kind of gradation and distribution that we get in custom data. We also have an indicator of developed land, percent of the land area that's developed, which is a factor in heat island vulnerability, urban heat island effect. We also found data on land being used for agriculture, which is, important and interesting, not just for land use, but to capture the economic component of land being used for agriculture and the potential workforce implications there and the potential for more migrant populations to possibly live in that area. And we do have access to home internet as well. And we're waiting for, again, some of those coastal storm surge flooding risk variables, waiting for a different measure on vegetative cover, which has also been in heat vulnerability indices, and thinking about some distance and access measures we could use to represent challenges for more rural populations. One big one that we've talked about that was on our list is distance to hospitals and healthcare. So looking to do that, or if that's not possible, try to find some other distance metrics there, and definitely open to suggestions there, if we have challenges for hospitals and healthcare. And then optionally, I'm not sure what we'll have, but something that represents variation in summer temperatures or, heat wave type conditions across the state.
Amanda, I have a question.
Sure.
And I apologize if this is a stupid question. The home internet, is that sort of similar to the distance from hospitals healthcare in terms of what it is showing us? Or
it would be the percentage of homes that have some kind of, I forget, I'll have to look up whether it's high-speed internet at all rather than a distance measure.
And in terms of so this falls under access to facilities. I'm looking at the kind of the definition of pillar 3, climate risks, environmental conditions, access to facilities. Maybe
no, it could, again, that was, some of these are gray areas. Do you put that under the population or do you put that under kind of land characteristics? And I think it probably fell here because it's likely, correlated with, whether there's broadband available in the area or what types of internet are available by virtue of being in a more rural community. So we put it more on that side. But definitely it could be on either slide.
So just to make sure I'm understanding, so this does start to get you to identifying rural communities that have less access to resources specifically.
That's the goal. Yep.
Okay, thank you.
And again, there's other variables we might have wanted that would have been more challenging. We'd love to talk in person in more detail on how to represent challenges for rural communities as well.
Eddie, you want to ask your question why it's not readily available?
Sorry, I just found it odd looking at Pillar 3 that storm surge risk and sea level rise, that we're waiting for those indicators. I thought those are readily available and captured and probably even up on public databases. I have a follow-up question. Yeah.
Awesome. Great question. So yes, so all these data points are very much readily available in public data, but they're in a completely different format than the census tract format that we need for this analysis. So they're in shapes that represent where that coastal risk occurs, but we have to figure out, what specific census tracts those are in, and what proportion of the census tract might have that risk. So we're working. There will be a GIS kind of subcontractor hired to work through a lot of the decisions that need to be made and the implementation to take a lot of this public data that's in another format to have it analyzed and estimated at the census tract level that we need to feed this analysis.
Gotcha. Yeah, because that's like some basic climate risk threats. Like if we're not able to figure out climate risk from storm surge and sea level rise in this mapping effort, we're up a certain creek. And just a quick follow-up question: how will we or how can we assess cross-pillar threats? And let me give you a specific example. So I think it's like 10 years ago, NEJA, our group started something called the Waterfront Justice Project, which I think to this day is still the first citywide community resiliency campaign. We were specifically looking at the unique threats of industrial waterfront communities to storm surges, right? And what we did was we did a mapping exercise where we overlaid the Department of State storm surge projections with the city's zoning map, and we were able to but those appear based on this framework, two different pillars, right? Industrial manufacturing land in Pillar 2, and in Pillar 3, storm surge risk. So I'm just curious, how when you have those threats that appear in parallel pillars, is there a way that we'll be able to capture those threats in this as we move forward, identifying these threats? Or I'm just curious if anyone has a response to that.
Yeah, I mean, we're kind of showing these as pillars, just a way to organize, showing you the data that we have. That doesn't mean that the way that it's combined, it doesn't necessarily matter that one is in one column and one's in the other column. Both are being considered. We can decide to weight one more heavily than the other, but they're all going to be working kind of in interaction with each other. So we weren't planning on doing any there's so many things that are correlated, and there's so many things that do have stronger, effects in combination, but those combinations are almost endless. So we're kind of just planning on kind of using each of these as they are and rolling everything up to some kind of threat score and some kind of vulnerability score, with the option to possibly weight things differently. I mean, we're still really thinking, we're still looking at correlations, still considering whether we should have factors within. Maybe we'll do that, but at present, really just kind of looking at these on their own before we decide if we want to do any sub roll-ups.
I want to add to that a little bit, just because the pillars help us in our brains conceptualize these things, but I do think that in some ways they're a false dichotomy, just what Amanda was saying. So in some ways, if we try to put these pillars in buckets like this, I think is actually dangerous. So even though we're talking about them this way, that cross-pollination is really important. So the scenarios we've been creating are letting that be kind of pretty loose. Something we can tinker with, but I think we're better off thinking about factors is clumps of highly correlated things. We don't need to go there, but It's a really good question, Eddie, because as we present this, particularly as we start really whittling things down, what we don't want to do is present it in a way to falsely show that there's dichotomies or like groupings when there isn't. It's just for us to think, okay, we've got coverage in these different things and these concepts, but they're all correlated.
Right. Yeah, we just want to make sure we're showing how we're mapping against the legislation and some of the concepts. All right. Any other questions on these indicators? You know, you might have more once you can see the full list once we post that on SharePoint.
There's a question from Jared in the chat. Jared, did you want to just ask your question?
Yeah, sure. So just kind of working off of this concept of, you know, architectural elements, and you think of pillars and posts and lintel type concept, is there a possibility to kind of create a category or a bucket where we can house some of these indicators that are more, I guess, more prevalent or more, you know, just kind of what Eddie was talking about, that seemed like there might be some connection there for us to conceptually understand this or track it ourselves? Because these pillars and posts, they are connected in some ways. And so having a list there with some of the obvious ones might be a way for us to keep track.
Yeah, that's a great suggestion. We'll consider how to represent that and illustrate that. What were there particular variables that you see that should be elevated to that level?
I'd have to go back and look at the revised list. So I guess the short answer is no, not at this pass.
Okay, no, that's helpful. Good to think about how we're going to present this and communicate the complexity of this.
To add to that, because I think that this is a worthy discussion to have in the sense of how do we bring forward certain indicators that we think are like the Uber indicator versus not. Like, we're going to have that conversation about income in a little bit, but like, how do we handle that? Because with threats and vulnerabilities, part of the reason why we wanted to go with this larger order category was to let all of these indicators within it kind of swim free and hang out together. And then, you know, there's so many ways that we can manipulate the data. And this is part of the reason why there's so many different scenarios here. So it's hard. So what I would love is for each of you to be thinking about, are there things that you have found in your experience like to be really important, so that we are aware of it, because we can't be experts in all of this, even though all of a sudden Amanda knows a lot about benzene. I don't want to keep picking on benzene, but it just shows up there, so it's there. But, you know, like all of a sudden we know a lot about these little things, but we don't know everything. And with your experiences, that's where we need it. So now that we've all Googled lintel, I think we need to think through what are those different indicators that are really, really important. We know some of them, but in this case, more feedback from you is really important here. Sorry, Amanda, go forth.
Let's go to the next slide, and then we'll have a break after this next slide. I really appreciate everyone digging into this. So on the vulnerability side, I think we have much stronger coverage in terms of the data we have and the data we're still waiting for. I think we have a lot to map against each portion of the legislation. So, you know, this, you know, really is concentrated in Pillar 2, which really speaks to people, and the legislation lays out, you know, different groups of people. But let's just look at Pillar 1 for a second. So Pillar 1 talked about pollution burden that causes negative public health effects. And there is pretty granular, geographically granular data on several negative public health effects. So we already have asthma ED visits and COPD ED visits, which is great. And the DOH is helping us also with premature deaths, an age-adjusted premature death metric. and low birth weight births, both of which, and we could definitely debate what pillar these go in. Again, mathematically, the way how things are working out, it doesn't really matter what column things go in. We are excited to maybe integrate low birth weight. That was in California because that is a good reflection of maternal health and conditions, environmental risks, burdens that mothers might have experienced regardless of where they might have lived previously. So if there is a migrant population or people moving to the area, even if they weren't reflected in the census, that might be captured in low birth weight births to mothers in that area. And premature deaths also can speak to kind of the cumulative effects and experiences of people living in that area. So that all the interactions of both environmental threats and vulnerabilities. And so in pillar 2 in the middle, you see a bunch of different things.
Hey, Amanda, before you go to pillar 2, Sonal has a question and it might be related to pillar 1, so I wanted to break in.
It's actually a pillar 2 comment.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. Oh, I see Abigail's comment about heat-related illness. Sonal, did you have a different question?
It's actually related to heat, but it is a different question.
Okay. In terms of heat-related illness, that was something we did pursue. And we talked to the DOH about that a little bit. I might put Neil on the spot in a minute to talk about that. One of the challenges there, a couple challenges there, when we go to this really small geography, that data can be somewhat unstable. And another challenge there when you're dealing with something specific like that is the coding of the health data. That something like heat-related illness could be coded in a bunch of different ways. So that sense that there might be a little bit less certainty and instability in the data, both because of the kind of admitting conditions someone might have had and how they got classified, as well as there's, maybe relatively fewer heat-related illnesses and might not be stable rates, and we might have more missing data. Neil, do you want to say anything more about that?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Amanda. I think we're probably okay on it's not so much the definition. I think it's more of the numbers issue that you mentioned, getting down to small areas and being able to have a number that people thinking of as stable, and also protecting confidentiality. That's the primary reason. Certainly one that if we had the numbers, it would make sense to include.
Mm-hmm. So that's a place where we're just hoping that in combination, some of the land use variables and population characteristics could help, knowing that we will have, developed land, vegetative cover. We might not have density itself, but things related to density, maybe. And then we also have, people with disabilities and other health vulnerabilities that might be correlated with heat-related illness.
So before we move on from heat, I just want to make sure that Sonal, your question was answered, and then Eddie also is in the stack.
Yeah, my question is a little bit different, but it is me thinking about heat, since that's something WEACT works a lot on, with regards to the sort of the numbers being low enough, luckily for now, that it's hard to get around the privacy concerns. I definitely know that's a major issue. But and I do agree with what Neil said, that there are enough kind of items in here that I do believe that the heat illness is going to be well covered. One other thing that I was thinking of along the same lines of the low birth weight is premature birth, and I'm wondering if that's something you all thought about putting in there. I don't remember if that was on the indicator list to begin with, but there's a lot of research coming out about heat and premature birth relations, so that can also be a good indicator that gets at heat, and also air pollution just generally.
Yeah. Yeah, I know we definitely discussed the strengths and weaknesses of low birth weight and premature births with the DOH, and I might let Neil address that question.
Yeah, so I think that's a good suggestion as another that is important. I don't have the numbers in front of me. I suspect that I'd have to check on the numbers and look at it. So let me just note that, and I can follow up with you if that's okay.
Mm-hmm. I think in some cases, you know, we trying to understand the correlations as well. You know, if premature births might be a subset of low birth weight births, how highly correlated they might be. In some cases, might only pick one indicator that that it more expansively represents something. So, for example, for asthma and COPD, we also have DOH also provided indicators on asthma-related hospital visits, but those are very highly correlated with ED visits, and in some cases might be a subset or overlap. So we decided instead of trying to include both asthma, ED, and hospital visits to just focus on ED visits, which was a little bit more comprehensive. But a great question about premature births, and we'll revisit the reasoning there.
It's your turn, Eddie.
Hey, so I don't know how Department of State captures heat-related deaths. I want to just share this next anecdote just to give you guys a sense of that there may be problematic ways that data is being collected. So last summer, the City Council passed a couple of heat-related bills, which Tunisia have been pushing for years. One of which is asking the Department of Health to clarify how they calculate heat-related deaths in New York City. We've seen ranges in different academic studies from the 112, I think, or 14 annual New York City heat-related deaths that I think is the official New York City Department of Health number, to academic papers estimating close to over 600 deaths a year. That's a pretty wide gap, right? And as we started digging in deeper into the methodology, and I may get some of this wrong. I would defer to my staff that did the research and work on this. But my understanding is for New York City to have a heat-related death be categorized that way, first, it has to happen during an official heat wave, which, the meteorological definition is 3 consecutive days of 90-degree weather and above. So if the mercury is over 90 2 days in a row, and the third day it dips to 89, those 3 days are not considered a heat wave. And if someone passes in those 3 days, therefore that death is not counted as a heat-related death. And there are a couple of other methodological problems, but we are concerned that the number of heat-related deaths in New York City are potentially, probably seriously undercounted. I don't know how New York State calculates it, but I share all this to just be clear that even some of the data sets that we're looking at, it's garbage in, garbage out. Like if you're just applying on some level, even arbitrary definitions to what you are then measuring, you're not capturing the full picture of that. So the heat-related stuff is we believe it's being problematically assessed in New York City, and I don't know how New York State. I don't know if the state relies on city number reports, or if you guys do something independent, but it's just an example of if something isn't properly measured, it's hard to even get the true vulnerability that it represents. But I'll stop there.
Yeah, you're absolutely right, Eddie. I think it's a good point. I don't know the details on New York City's definition either. I know when we calculated, we weren't necessarily limiting it to only heat waves. So I'd have to, I could talk with some of our colleagues in New York City as well and just kind of confirm my understanding of how they calculate. I think one of the other big problems that we're interested in and understanding better is when a heat heat-related illness isn't recognized. So then it's not even reported as such in a record. So we never know that there was to it. I think that's probably also an issue too. But absolutely right about the frustration sometimes of data. No data is perfect. We do the best we can.
I do think here, this is one of those areas where it might be that we're doing a better job capturing those data or modeling those data indirectly by looking at some of the threat components of heat island effects, coupled with some of the things in the vulnerabilities area. So I think that actually we're probably doing a better job by, getting some of those underlying reasons for the heat-related deaths as opposed to the direct measure of it.
Yeah, we'll take that into consideration and revisit the data availability and considerations there. It sounds like this is an important area that you've thought a lot about. So
certainly the survivors issue would come into play with heat-related deaths as well.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so thank you. I think we will take a little break after this. I just want to make sure we've kind of talked about everything on the vulnerability side. So in the middle column, the legislation, which I don't have pulled up, mentions income, unemployment, education, race and ethnicity. I think it mentions language, and it mentions rent, home ownership costs and burdens. So you see, we have, census data for all of those, which is, although it's typically collected in a sample and not population wide, really the best data to get at some of these things, even if it might not break things down very much, as we've discussed before. They don't really break down race and ethnicity, but the trade-off is they do kind of have the best sample and the best sampling approach. You'll also see here for things like income and poverty. We're just listing 2 of many income and poverty metrics. There might be other things like, should we use area median income itself? Should we use below 60%? Should we use childhood poverty or federal poverty? Should we use measures of income inequality, something like that? And in some cases, again, getting to those 56 variables, we certainly have pulled data on all of those and started to look at correlations. And this list kind of represents, after looking at correlations, what we think might be valuable. But again, there's still circulation and things moving on and off of this list, and things that might not be on this list that we have data for that might reemerge in the future. For example, for education, you can look at the percentage of the population who doesn't have a bachelor's degree or doesn't have a high school diploma. And again, you can imagine those are very highly correlated. So trying to understand how those are correlated with other things we know we're going to include, and try to find something that more uniquely measure a concept that might not be captured elsewhere. So in some cases, we might have 18 things on this list, but trying to narrow it down a little bit. Any thoughts or questions on the vulnerabilities side?
I'm not seeing anything in the chat. Do you want to take our 5-minute break?
Yeah, that would be great.
This is a good one. Good time. Stay tuned, guys. We're going to do scenarios in a minute.
We'll come back at 3:10, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hello, everyone. We're back from our 5-minute break. See if everybody's coming back on. And I do want to note that Elizabeth has joined us. Hi, Elizabeth.
I'm sorry I'm late, but I had to facilitate a national call. Thank you. Sorry about that.
Alex, are you still on mute? Are you trying to talk?
See, I think Alex might have gotten bumped from the webinar.
Oh no. Okay. She said she thinks things are breaking for her. She's having internet issues.
Okay.
Her. Okay. Okay, so I have the slides pulled up as well. So why don't I continue and I can share my screen? Just give me a second to get that set up. Oh, actually, I would need sharing permission.
Oh, that's right. I'll move that over to you.
Okay.
There you go.
I'm back.
Oh, there you are, Alex.
Just in time. Okay, Alex. Do you want to share your screen again?
Yeah, let me just set it up. Okay. Oh, internet.
All right, you're all set, Alex.
Thank you. Okay, let's see here. Can you all see
Yes.
that?
Yes.
Okay. Cool. I don't know what happened. Thank you for your patience. That wasn't fun. Okay. Now I don't have all the beautiful setup I had before, so I won't be able to see your chats as well. Sorry about that. Just holler if you have something to say. Okay. I just kind of want to start with a reiteration of, like, we covered a lot on and went into a lot of detail on indicators. Does anyone have any questions that sprung up?
Yeah, keep any detailed questions you have. All questions are good questions. So critical to hear and discuss everything now. These are critical decisions as we think about what indicators to use. We want to be able to defend them, defend what we're using and what we're not using. So keep talking. Thank you.
Okay. Next, we wanted to talk about, okay, we got into this a little bit with the whole, we have these threats and vulnerabilities components, but then, how do we combine them? And so we have these big buckets, the threat score and the vulnerability score. Amanda's going to kind of go through different options.
Right. So basically, as I said, there's many ways to boil things up to a threat score and a vulnerability score. We could kind of build factors or weight things within for now until we kind of know what we have to work with and or have guidance on what's more important. We're kind of giving everything equal weight within the threat score and the vulnerability score. But then that's what we have to work with. And we can do many things with those two components. So on the left, you see the option, if we kind of take those as separate components, we could either multiply them or add them. So you could kind of add the threat score with a vulnerability score and then say, okay, everyone has this overall score combining threats and vulnerabilities. Then we could look at the distribution overall and say, the top 25% are disadvantaged communities, for example, is just one thing. You could also multiply those two scores together to say that, okay, threats represent kind of the risks, the factors that people face, and vulnerabilities might be the resources, capacity, adaptive capacity they might have to face them and address them. So that might be, you know, you could consider that to be a multiplicative relationship and multiply those things, where again, you might do something to that, add or multiply. Then you have an overall score. You could look at that overall score and say, okay, the top X% of this overall score we could consider disadvantaged. So we kind of put those together, even though it's a different mathematical operation of adding or dividing, adding or multiplying. The overall idea is that you have those two things, you turn them into one thing, you look at the distribution of the one thing, and then you say, you know, a certain part of this distribution might be considered a disadvantaged community. So that's kind of one category of options. There's kind of many ways to get to that score, do those things, but that's kind of one idea to somehow we're going from this very detailed level to two big things to one big thing, and then the designation. And then the other way, you know, to think about it, well, one of many other ways, if you have other ideas, we'd love to hear them, is to treat these two things a little bit separately and filter or intersect them. So you might say, okay, we have the threat score and the vulnerability score, and each of those two things has their own distribution. So you could be in the top 25% of the threats, but you know, you could be in only the top 75% of vulnerability. So you could be high threats and low vulnerabilities, or low threats and high vulnerabilities, or you could be low on both, or you could be high on both. So you could say, okay, well, we really only want to think about communities that both face high threats and risks and have relatively higher vulnerability. So almost like a rule-based approach where you say, okay, well, let's take communities that have a certain threat score, are relatively higher threats and relatively higher vulnerabilities, and say we're going to designate the communities that are in the top X% of this and top X% of this. So maybe mathematically it ends up being maybe the top 50% or the top 45% of threats and the top 50% of vulnerabilities would get you to your overall 25% if that's where you want to be.
I want to add weight to this in the sense of like, here's the reasoning why we're noodling over this, because others have multiplied or added, and the multiplicative, you know, theoretically makes a lot of sense because you're like, well, these things exacerbate one another, so let's multiply them and then push out this kind of like distribution that we have. What happens though is that say you have a ridiculously high threat score, but a pretty low vulnerability score. If you multiply them or add them, you could still pass through. And that could be fine. That could be something that this group is okay with. But we wanted to also present the idea of, if that is the case, then there might be some places that are less vulnerable as a population, but really, really hit hard from the environmental threats. And it goes through, that's a DAC, okay, that's fine. But we want to bring it to the fore that that is something that could happen, and that an alternative way to make sure that that doesn't happen, if this group wants to make sure that that doesn't happen, is to create a more of an intersectional thing. So rather than create just one giant score, you have two, and then you make sure that they have high threats and they have high vulnerabilities, and then you have a bit more control there.
Yeah, so you could decide where to draw that line. You could say, okay, what if we want, you know, the top 30% of threats and top 60% of vulnerabilities to count. It's a way to kind of more explicitly say how you think a disadvantaged community should score on each of these.
This may seem noodly and kind of crazy, but it's really trying to bring the heart of environmental justice to this, to really own both components of it and think through it. So there's no decision that we've made to sit here, but rather giving you options to think through. As we get further down the line and start presenting scenarios to you where you really evaluate this will be one of the parts.
Yeah, so we are, you know, actively working with each of these options and evaluating each of these options. And that's where, you know, again, we keep coming back to much the ground truthing census tracts will help us. You know, we can do this and we could look at summary statistics and look at maps, but the true test is going to be, where do the communities, when we run each of these scenarios, where do the communities that you believe should be DACs and should not fall in these scenarios?
So Amanda and Alex, can you take a shot at describing the filter intercept concept again?
Yeah, poor Eddie. Let me do it in a non-technical way.
For me as well.
Well, I get it. It's hard. Like, this was something we've been like noodling on for a lot, and it's mostly at the heart of it is less the statistical side. Whoa. And more about the conceptual side. And I know it's hard to try to figure this out with just the concepts, but the idea here is you have a threat score, 1 to 100, and you score 50 on that. You have a vulnerability score, 1 to 100, and you score 25 on that. And if we multiply those, then you get certain scores. If you add them, then you get a certain score, one big score. But if you go and you take this filter intersect thing, you basically say, well, does that 50 out of 100 constitute a high threat? And should it pass it? And does a vulnerability score of, say, 25 indicate a high vulnerability score in the scheme of what we have? And if you've multiplied them, that number might look really, really big. If you intersect it, you're like, well, it's only 25 out of 100 for this vulnerability score. Even if it's a threat score of 50, which is a higher score, I don't think it's a DAC because this vulnerability score isn't high enough. And that really is the heart of the filter.
Okay, so it could be, so for example, it's a community that has higher incomes and they don't have the social health outcomes that would make them vulnerable, but because of where they are, they might have a very high sea level rise threat. And so the sea level rise threat is gonna weigh them into a DAC designation if we were to multiply the scores. Is that kind of the difference?
Yeah.
And then
I think
had
the
a question
other thing
about
is
the
that,
environment screen.
Yeah, is that multiplying, we don't actually know, multiplying, you don't always exactly know what you might get. That, you know, being somewhat high on one and somewhat in the middle on the other one, once you multiply those things and look at the distribution of, again, it might not be as easy to see why a community ends up somewhere. But that's, again, it's really, we're really at the beginning of evaluating these options, and the ground truth communities are going to be so helpful to know what the implications on the ground are when we do these two different things. To address the question of what EnviroScreen does, they do multiply the scores. We have talked to them about that, and we understand that they did not test these other methods or didn't necessarily have a reason for not using other methods. They were using that method on a theory that vulnerabilities, you know, tend to exacerbate risks or, you know, reflect your capacity to adapt to risks. But I mean, I think that our thinking is that same theory holds with the intersection approach, that looking for, you know, communities with high vulnerabilities and high threats kind of shows you communities' adaptive capacity as well. So yeah, so the jury's still out really on, you know, the pros and cons of these different approaches until we, you know, really have the true data and better data and can map this against, you know, actual communities that we think should be in our.
We're anticipating that the sea level rise is going to dramatically shift the threat score and that this will be an issue coming forward. But I think this is a continued conversation. And I think that to be clear, this is not like a decision we want now, but it is something that we need to think about. And we think it's important, hence why, you know, it's hard to make this decision. So Eddie, I want to hear from you because I think you want to talk, but just know that what we're trying to think through here is a way to make sure that we are finding a balance so that things like the Hamptons possibly don't get pulled in to as a DAC because they have such, I don't know, I'm making stuff up, but the idea here is like we don't want something that has a low vulnerability score but a very, very high threat score popping through.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I mean, I think, we can definitely, continue to describe this conceptually. Ideally, what we also want to do is be able to map this with data and show you options that have, identical variables, identical everything, and are only different in this respect, and allow you to go through and see, zoom in on a particular area to see like what are the differences? What is this doing on the ground if we use these 3 approaches with the exact same inputs and the same threats and vulnerabilities? So that's what we're working toward to kind of avoid like fully deciding this based on, statistical theory, which is not at all what we want to do.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, this is Neil. I might just add too. I feel like with the filter intersect approach, what's kind of nice about that, not to lead us in one direction, but ultimately, I think people will focus on, where are the DACs, right? Where are the disadvantaged communities, and having a definition based on filter intersect potentially would keep more transparent, if you will, the fact that a community may have been high on both in order to be defined as a DAC, where I think Alex or Amanda may have alluded to the fact that with the multiplicative or additive approach, you can have one very high on one or the other. So I just think kind of putting the data out there, and people might just take a quick glance on the actual methods that were used, but really focus on the DAC. In some ways, the filter intersect approach may be more straightforward, but let's think about it a little bit more.
Yeah, we'd be able on a map to kind of, we still haven't at all mapped out what the public display would be, but you could conceivably kind of show for each census tract its threat score and its vulnerability score, so you could see why it landed where it landed.
Right.
And can I just say that this is one of the things, to your point, Eddie, about, figures don't lie, but liars figure, is actually to be as transparent as possible. There are so many little things that we could be doing to basically guide the definition one way or another, and we need to be like explicitly transparent about each of them. This is one of the big ones that I think other places haven't considered, or they just did it on theory as opposed to really thinking through the implications of what that could mean, particularly for New York and its specialness of being New York, and the geography and the threats, the vulnerabilities. Go, Eddie.
Yeah, no, thanks for recognizing the complexity of this and some of the hard choices in front of us. I mean, part of what's also troubling me about this whole thing is, and I totally hear you guys, it's not meant to devolve into a statistical, game, if you will, but when you're dealing with statistics, it's kind of part of the territory. What bothers me is, and I'm with Jared. Like, I need to sit with this a little while longer and walk through it. But there are different. Even not all vulnerabilities are alike, right? So, what weighs on me is this attempt to come up with an equation doesn't. How can I put this? What's missing is, for me, is what is the medical vulnerable? Like, just because a community is deemed more vulnerable, they may be more vulnerable to less urgent health exposures. And part of what's worrying me is how does the relative relatively speaking, the differences of vulnerabilities in terms of what is an urgent exposure versus I think you guys get what I'm saying. So that's what I'm struggling with, which is okay, well, not everyone, even high vulnerability doesn't necessarily mean the same thing. And I don't know if I'm looking at this wrong, or in fact, the vulnerabilities there is a way to capture the vulnerability when it comes to life or health threatening exposures. I'll stop there. Sorry.
Oh, I think you're right. Amanda, pull in if you want. One of the things I think what's hard about this is it's like a 1,000-layer onion that we're trying to peel. Right. And in this case, like what you're talking about is trying to make sure that we have these components for the vulnerabilities and the threats at the correct balance and getting all of that right? And then, then we've taken these buckets of vulnerabilities and threats, and then we have these two scores. It's inside that we're doing it, right? Because it's like we can't have everything just putting in, 20 or 30 different indicators and just letting it ride how it goes. We have to figure out conceptually, well, A, we could, but B, where do we want to put our emphasis versus not? And so that's where some of these decisions are like peeling an onion of, do we capture it within this vulnerabilities part, and do we then make that health component, those critical things that are extremely timely, do we make those more important within this vulnerability score? Then we go and we take this score, and then we go to the next step. That's one way of doing it. It's one of the things about this is we literally have so many options. You could do so many different things, and it's trying to take the most methodologically sound, but also the thing that for you guys feels the most right. And that's why we have these incredibly hard meetings where we're giving you crazy statistical concepts, because we want to get your gut on, well, here's why this doesn't feel right. It's this conversation that helps guide us in the next iteration of things. I'm just sorry I have to put you through that pain.
No, that's really hard, and certainly on both the threats and the vulnerabilities, there's things that might be, much more indicative of negative public health outcomes than others. And so, yeah, partially, there's so many ways to deal with that. I think California dealt with it through really narrowing down their indicator list and making sure they, were kind of stripping out highly correlated things and really narrowing it down to core variables. That's part of it. And then, yeah, we do have the option for this brown box and this blue box at the top. There's a lot of ways you could combine things to get to those two scores. We could weight things a little bit more. Yeah, I think with weighting, there's, the trade-off in that idea of transparency, what does a weight of 3 mean compared to a weight of 1? Yeah, it's tricky. So I think our first thing to do is to kind of narrow the list down. And then once we have that narrow list down and we think we're really dealing with the most critical things, and we've stripped out things that are represented by other things, we've stripped out the really high secondary variables that are highly correlated with others, then we will have to decide what's important and how do we deal with that. Do we deal with that through weighting or maybe more explicitly? And Alex is going to talk about that with income.
I will say this, that we're thinking about so much and trying to consider so much, and we welcome any questions that you have both now and then also at any time. The amount of time we have limited to these meetings, we're trying to cover off on the most critical things that will get us to the next step. But there's so many things, and if you have questions about it, please let us know. Since we know your time is very valuable, that the 2 hours we have, we're trying to hit on certain things, but we are always willing to get on the phone and have conversations about the very specific parts. So if you have, following this, some different questions, please let us know. It's really important we hear from you each, and I know that what we're giving you is a barrage of crazy things. This is not easy, and it can't be, but like all good research, it has to be painful a little bit, because that means we're actually thinking about it. Okay, so we're going to go through a couple example scenarios, and I'm going to tell you right now, I want you all to take a deep breath, because we're going to throw some numbers at you, and there's no easy way of doing this, but there are two things that we're trying to show or at least discuss and get out and get your gut feeling about. So I would worry less about the statistics behind it and more about how does this feel to you when you see these numbers. One of the other things is, so we're trying to figure out what's a fair regional mix here. Do we just kind of, we talked about this last time a little bit, do we let everything kind of just go by the data we have, which means New York City is going to get a higher proportion of DAX, or do we regionally kind of fix things so that it's based more proportionally on population? We're going to show you those so that you can have a reaction and then let us know what you're thinking and whether you think it's good. We've also want to think about income being a very, very important indicator for us, and also in California, how they overlaid income after the fact. I want us to overtly be thinking about income and whether we need to do something special with income from the beginning so that it's just like overt and transparent right from the beginning. I will also say that it's gonna be a big table of numbers and a little bit of graphs by them. And I'll run through every single one with you. But I also want you to know that these are just some of the diagnostic statistics we're looking at. If there are other things you're curious about, please let us know so that we can add them in. We just chose the ones that we're immediately looking at right now, but there are many, many iterations. Okay. First scenario is looking at statewide versus regional, where basically we've created two different scores or scenarios where we're looking at things. The first one is we have restricted the proportion of DAX being assigned to different census tracts based on the proportion of the regional of the region. So New York City versus the rest of the state. So you'll see a breakdown where in New York City, actually, the scenario A actually aligns with the population proportions. The second scenario is not regionally restricted at all. Let me run through what you're seeing on the screen. At the very top, you see the total number of census tracts that are designated a DAC, and then what that is proportional to the state of census tracts. So in this case, we kept it at 25%. The next thing you're going to see is the RECs. Am I getting that right? The regional zones, or the different regions in New York State, and you're going to see the breakdown of the proportion of DACs in that region for the two scenarios. The little red lines there I've added so that you can see what is proportion to the statewide, the proportion of census tracts in that region, so that you can see what they are and compare a little bit, not just across, but then with that red line. At the bottom, we have a couple diagnostic elements here, and the first one is the percent of, correct me if I'm wrong, Amanda, because I keep messing this up, the percent of census tracts that are HUD qualified, that are DACs.
Yeah, the percent of DACs that are also HUD qualified census tracts. So in the first column of our 1,185, 87% are also HUD qualified census tracts, which was just a good benchmark for income, since HUD qualified census tracts are largely income based.
Same thing with the lower income percentile. What we were looking for here, again, there's no right or wrong answer. This was just us trying to understand how things broke out. Was a higher number than the statewide proportion, which was the 50 here, means that we're capturing a larger group of lower income census tracts. And the same thing holds true, the higher number of BIPOC communities in the census tracts that we're covering. So 2 disclaimers, this is early data, so we went through all the indicators that we don't have that we're currently trying to wrangle and get, and so we assume that we're going to get quite a few things that are going to shift, particularly within the threat area. So this is just statewide restriction versus no restriction.
Alex, could you describe what that, just for simplicity's sake, as as probably the most statistically challenged person on this panel, let me just ask you, the 43%, that reflects the percentage of New York City's total relative to the state population. New York City represents 43% of the total population. And what's the 72%? Like, I'm just trying to be clear about
totally.
those two. Yeah.
Totally. So the state, so if you go to the far right column, the statewide proportions, New York City, the census tracts within New York City, the New York City region, represent 44% of the census tracts in New York State.
Okay.
And then when you look at scenario A versus scenario B in the blue bars, and the 43% versus 72, that is the percent of DACs within that region. So the percent of census tracts that are DACs within that region. So in this case, we would be, sorry, go ahead, Amanda.
It's the percentage of all the DACs statewide that fall in that region. So it's saying that of all the 1,185 DACs that are in scenario A, 43% of those DACs are in New York City, compared with 44% of census tracts overall in statewide are in New York City.
That helps a lot. And what does the 72% reflect? What's the no restriction?
So that is, it's just a different, it's the same metric, but the different scenario. So in the scenario where we didn't place any restrictions on where DACs could fall, just seeing where those threats and vulnerability scores ended up, and looking at the overall distribution, it comes out that of the 1,209 census tracts that are DACs in scenario B, 72% of all of those 1,209 census tracts are in the New York City area.
Yeah, I'm just, my problem is I'm not understanding the difference between scenario A and B.
Yeah.
And I don't know if others are, but yeah.
So I can explain that a little bit. So this has to do with, scenario B, everyone's data goes in and every community gets a threats and a vulnerability score. And we looked at the overall distributions of those scores statewide and just said, okay, who's at the top of those distributions statewide? Let's just take the top 25% of those overall distribution, regardless of where they are. So we're just doing one big distribution and slicing off the top 25%. Whereas on the left, on scenario A, we're separating things out a little bit and we're saying, okay, let's look at New York City differently from the rest of the state. So let's see the threats and vulnerabilities in New York City, and we'll take the top 25% of communities in New York City, as well as the top 25% of communities in the rest of the state. So it's essentially forcing, that at 43%, 44% might have been a rounding thing, but it's essentially saying that we're making sure that New York City is only a proportional share of the DACs.
Remember last time we met, we talked about that this was something that we wanted to get to the group as far as and have an open discussion about that regional versus like just a statewide and seeing how it lies. What these two scenarios do is basically have every single the same indicators, the same weight, everything except for this one change, which is saying like, let's look at New York City separate than the rest of the state in scenario A versus let's not, and let's just let everything fall and then see where the most, acute are.
So Amanda and Alex, there's a question about if scenario B is a more comprehensive approach.
I think that is an open question. They're both, it's a choice that this group needs to make, that neither is more comprehensive than others. It is that, do you feel that each region should have, a proportional kind of restriction based on the census tracts that are the proportion of census tracts that reside in that region, or do you not? And I don't see I from my view as someone who's trying to get and infuse your opinions and your thoughts on this, it's your thoughts on this that really count to me. There's no comprehensive or gaps other than what you see, and it's hard. Elizabeth, I see your hand. Go ahead.
So I've tried not to say anything because I came into this call so late that I feel like I've missed a lot, and I don't want to do a reset just because I wasn't available for the first half of the call. I think my concern, you know, I mentioned earlier that I have problems with us focusing on census tracts because they don't always tell the story, and that also while I think income has to be a priority, I also think that with people of color, with Black, Indigenous, and people of color, that it shouldn't just be limited to income, that it should be centered on race, because the legacy of extraction is one that lands in our lungs regardless of income. So I don't know how you do that here, and I know you're struggling, but I just wanted to flag those things because we have an opportunity to create a model that will transform how people collect and present data when it comes to frontline communities being impacted by climate change. And so the problem is that your data sets, the places you get the information, come out of a very conventional way of thinking about collecting data and are not helping us in the way that we need to be helped. So anyway, I know I've mentioned this before, but I just want to flag it because I think it's really important.
Yeah, Elizabeth heard on that. I think it's actually vital. I do want to say, and I think it's worth pulling back just a minute because it's something that is so important. In this case, we went through the threats and vulnerabilities. We also wanted to show and talk through the fact that we're kind of pulling in and thinking about threats from a historical discrimination way. And then what we have and what we're considering for inclusion here, and I know that I'm happy to go through this in more detail with you, but the idea here is that we are including some very critical and very important things. So we've got, in the models that you're seeing, we have Hispanic and Black, and we've got limited English proficiency, we've got renters, and we've got poverty and income. So all of those are entering in. But I hear you also to the point that census tracts are an issue with the data that you're collecting and not having the resolution. I don't have a solution to that other than to say that I agree. And if there is a current timing constraint for us as far as what we can do, so let's figure out some recommendations of what data can be gathered and how, so that we can address that in future iterations.
Can I get on stat?
Yeah.
Also, Elizabeth, I'm sorry, do you have a direct response?
Yeah, I was just texting a second that term Hispanic needs to be deconstructed. It erases Blackness and makes it seem like we're all in the same situation when we're not. And so even that term I find is completely inappropriate. You could be called Hispanic and be of European ancestry. You know, it just I'm just saying to use that term for me is a real problem. But yeah, go ahead, Rawa. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Elizabeth. And if I could just go a little bit deeper, just looking at, I think we're defining it as Western New York, and I imagine very similar kinds of things would happen in like the capital region. Is when we look, so coming out of New York City and coming kind of to like my area, it would be really great to look at the city, if we could break out the city of Buffalo outside of Western New York, because what we've experienced here is once industry left and extracted from our place and like left all the pollution, we have about 280,000 people. And I think Buffalo's the second highest or largest populated city outside of New York City. And but when you look at Western New York or even just Erie County, there's about 1.1 million people. And that is really indicative of white flight into suburban and urban sprawl. And as you can see that those like demographics are pretty monolithic. And so I don't know if there's a way to get to kind of like the need. And so the thing about Buffalo, and I know y'all have heard me say this again, but I can't help myself, which is we are the third poorest city in America. We're also the sixth most segregated. We were the fourth most segregated, now the sixth most segregated. We're also a city that is 42% African American. We have a huge immigrant refugee population. It's the second highest resettled city in America, as well as folks of Latinos, primarily of Puerto Rican descent. So I would just say, like, it would be really good for me to see if we are getting kind of to the truth of, like, within just like the city of Buffalo, for example.
Yeah. And dude, you just plugged the whole ground truthing thing that we need from you, I think, in some ways too, right? As we go through this, what we can pull those out. And so we will as we start going through this. But I would also invite each of you to share the census tract regions that you think are really critical for inclusion as a DAC, so that we can be looking at these scenarios and starting to assess them and say, like, okay, well, we've got this, we've got this. Again, I've only heard from 3 of you, and those data are, when we have like that 1,000-layer onion, that information from you is what will critically help us to assess which things to do, both on the indicators that we include, how we restrict things or not, how we weight things. All of those methodological considerations are on the table. So we would really, really need that. Okay, we're getting to 12:51. I know we've thrown a lot at you with this. I want to go through one more, but I also want to invite each of you to talk with me if you have these concerns, to give us a call and to talk through these different elements. I value your time. I think it's just critical that we hear from you and get your insights and thoughts on this. This is so hard. So whatever input you can give to us beyond what you're giving us here, which is invaluable, will be really helpful in guiding us. Okay. Anybody? I heard a whisper there. Okay. So any other thoughts on regional versus statewide restrictions? I think that, you know, this is just an early one and it will shift. The proportions are there, but I'm getting a sense that some people may think that scenario B without restrictions is a better approach than others. Is that, am I correct in that sense?
To be candid, I'm still having. What would be helpful, at least to me, is if you guys can email us a description of the difference between scenario A and scenario B. Then that, because I'm having a lot of trouble understanding why New York City is 43% on the one and then 72% on another. I'm sure it's just like the synapses need to fall into place. Maybe a written description would help me, but I don't know how this real.
Yeah, and the big question is this: which one seems, you know, what strikes you, what feels better, more reasonable to you? Is it that 43% of the DACs are in New York City, or that, you know, 72% are? We can certainly share the methods, but the big question is more of that, like, sense of equity.
I just don't get the difference between those two numbers. I mean, and it's such a significant difference that I know I'm missing something key in the question that you're asking. So, like, once, and if others understand it, I'll be quiet. Obviously.
So I think for a next step, we'll come up with an explanation that describes the differences between these two scenarios, and we'll have that as, you know, moving forward to get more input from you once we have that information in a different way for you. And I think Sonal has a question.
It's not a question, it's more just like a comment of what I feel like I'm grappling with. As someone who's, you know, a representative of New York City community, understanding that, you know, and I guess that's kind of what Rob was sort of saying to some extent, but understanding the implication of what it would mean to almost like take away DACs from other parts of New York State and what that looks like for other parts of New York State, I feel like that's where I'm having trouble saying, oh, one versus the other, because I don't feel like I fully understand that implication of the rest of the state. So I guess that's kind of where all of this, the examples will come in and testing will come in. But I think that'll, once I kind of get a better idea of what that means with the help of this whole group, I think it'll be easier to make that final decision. But it does seem like there would be some pretty big implications depending on which one we're going for. I mean, it's a big difference.
Yeah, that is why we're leading with this one, because it's like such a big one. And I think what we will do is create kind of a memo or something so that each of you can review and see with detail. We can also, I'm happy to go through that with you one-on-one and talk through the implications of it. I think this is literally a hot off the press of doing this yesterday as we're getting all these things. And that's why it's so hard to like conceptualize, because so many of these things are changing. But let us get you that information and we can run through it iteratively, because it is a hard concept. Go ahead, Elizabeth.
Can I just add that if we are having a difficult time processing it and understanding it, that the public is going to have a hard time. And so in terms of us being accountable to our base and to our people, it's really important that if we say this is not clear to us, that the clarity be made, and that the information that we're getting is also accessible to the public, so that they can see how we're coming up with these definitions and embracing these concepts. Because it's not enough for us to respond. It's really important that the process is really honoring the fact that big decisions are being made that impact people that are not at this table. So I would just ask that you do that.
Yeah. I would like to say, and I think Chris is absolutely right, like we're trying to move into the specifics and give the specifics here. And we are ideally going to do this with maps so that you can actually see it and so that you can round truth it and feel for it. Like that is absolutely our goal. One of the reasons why we hedged today was because we still have some really critical things that are missing from those maps. And so one of the things we didn't want to do was show you a bunch of maps that are going to clearly change now, when we need to theoretically be showing you what we're thinking about as we do it. So there is no way that this is ever going to be shown in like a public comment thing or trying to describe this way. It's more of us trying to explain to you some of the things that we think are so critical in the decisions that we have to make.
But even saying that, Alex, but even saying that builds trust. Even saying this is complicated, it's really hard, we're grappling with this, I know you need this kind of information, and saying that to the public builds trust, because I think that we need to in order to strengthen social cohesion. So thank you for that.
Yeah, this is so hard. And so I think what my job in this, to me, is to be as transparent as possible of the things that frankly we could manipulate in the background, and I don't want to ever do that with this. And so this is why this is hard and frustrating and hard to grapple with. But so know that this was like literally things that we're doing like as we go. What I would like to do is when you have that, when you've tinkered around with that ground truthing Tableau map, imagine a set where what we're trying to build once we get some of the more critical threats data that we don't have yet is a map where we have scenario 1, and then you have that colored on the map, and then you can see and dig around in that. And then you have scenario 2, and with a description, Eddie, in a lot of language and good clear language hopefully about what those differences are in the scenarios, so that you can kind of see that. We're not there yet because we're still missing those critical components, but we're building that tool as we speak. And so if you guys want to see some of that as we build it, I'd invite you to, I would love to show it to you, and also to test it on you to make sure that it does make sense.
So Alex, I think because we're coming up on time, let's get our next steps out there. So I know one is the memo with the clear explanation, some clarity on that. I'll ask again for, the ground truthing exercise. I'll send a reminder on how to do that, the Tableau tool. And then Alex also mentioned that there might be a way, right, Alex, for them to see the in progress on the visuals. Was that what I heard?
Yeah, but not publicly. I think
Okay.
I don't have that on a server yet or anything. We're
I
just
see.
tinkering with it. So if you want to see that, send me an email and I will show it to you and we can do it together.
And then that reminds me to plug again, the offer from Alex to do one-on-one phone calls to dig into whatever topics you might want that we didn't really have time to bring up on these 2-hour calls. And the last reminder I have is that we are trying to pin down the dates for April. So if you can help us out with looking at the dates that we sent around to let us know when we should hold the next meetings in April. All right, any other notes before we sign off?
Just one question.
Chris? Oh, go ahead, Eddie.
I don't know at what point or how this working group is going to weigh in on the overall state methodology for actually arriving at whether or not post-DAC, at the end of all this, the state is going to be on the hook for acknowledging or documenting the 35 to 40%. And with the insertion of benefits as opposed to direct funding, complicated this for everyone unnecessarily. We've been saying it for 2 years, but at what point are we going to have that conversation? Because I still don't know how the state intends to apply the 35 to 40% and how that conversation is going to play out with this working group.
Great, thanks, Amanda. I think that's a reminder for us because we are intending to bring that conversation to you all on the benefits and how the state is looking at that framework. Anything else, Chris, that I might have missed?
Yeah, no, I think, Rosa, that's right. I think there's still there is some work still that the agencies are doing to just land on, the investments in the programs and obviously, kind of the methodology for distributing those benefits. Obviously, we also want to, have the conversation with you all, before we, finalize and start to implement. So, I think we need to look at kind of what's left to do before we have a straw man and come back with you all and figure out what the right time is for that. But I know from the agency perspective, there's a sense of urgency to do this. So we're with you, Eddie, on that.
Thank you, Chris. All right, if there are no other next steps that we need to cover, we'll be sending around the emails as promised with that memo and with reminders for the ground truthing exercise.
And I just want to thank you for your patience and heart. I know this is hard, and so I'm just thankful that we're doing this together, and bear with us as we work through it. Thank you.
Thanks, Alex, and thank you, Amanda. Thanks, everybody. Take care.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.